Hey folks, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at elastic load balancers and specifically logging with elastic load balancers. So in our DevOps doctrine, let's click on this ELB and EC2 logging. Now again, we're going to focus on elastic load balancers. There will be a great deal of coverage on EC2 logging in upcoming lessons. So let's now focus on ELBs. So let's click our ELB and EC2 logging button, and taking a look at our diagram, our ELB access logs are stored in an S3 bucket. These access logs capture detailed information about requests sent to your load balancer. The access logs are very helpful to analyze traffic patterns and troubleshoot issues. Now, it's important to note that access logging is an optional feature of elastic load balancing that is disabled by default. So we first need to enable this logging. Now, the logs are stored in an S3 bucket that you specify. So part of the process here is the creation of an S3 bucket. And finally, key point, there is no additional charge for these access logs. Now, in this lesson, we're going to create an elastic load balancer, and we'll also create our S3 bucket for storing these logs. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about some key concepts. Let's click that button. All right. Access logs give detailed information about requests sent to the load balancer, like time the request was received, the client's IP address, request paths, server responses, and latencies. And again, this information is helpful in troubleshooting and just analyzing your traffic patterns. And it's key to note that this information is not the same as CloudTrail information or CloudWatch logs. There are some similarities, but there are also differences. So depending on your needs, you certainly can use all of these or whichever best suits your needs. And again, access logs are turned off by default. Here's a key point. Logs can be taken at intervals of 5 and 60 minutes. The default is 60 minutes, but you can ramp this up to 5. So with these logs, we can look at data from requests going to our applications, such as the timestamp, when the load balancer received the request, the client port, the IP address and port of the requesting client, backend port, the IP address and port of the instance that processed the request. So as you can see, we can certainly pinpoint where our traffic is coming from, and this may be helpful in troubleshooting situations. It may come down to an issue with a specific client, and with this data, we'll be able to pinpoint that. Now, some other important data, the request processing time. So for HTTP, it's the total time it took from the elastic load balancer receiving the request until the request is sent to an instance. What about TCP? Layer 4, the total time from the load balancer accepting a TCP SSL connection, SSL being SSL on TCP, to when it sent the first byte of data to an instance. Now, response time has this same information, it's just in reverse. So with all of this data, again, we can pinpoint our issues during troubleshooting. Which instances are taking the most time to deliver traffic? Also, with our timestamps, we can pinpoint time of day. Maybe the issues are based on heavy traffic during certain times of day. Or both. It could be a poorly responding instance, and it could also be a certain time of the day. But with all of this data, we will be able to pinpoint these issues. Now, when you are able to pinpoint a time frame, this could be really helpful. Suppose there was a push of a new application and then problems occurred. And again, with timestamps, we can pinpoint this compared to when the application was pushed. And with the timestamps, with the request and response data, it greatly assists troubleshooting these issues. Now, let's think about this a bit. So let's say our application is extremely busy. We could have thousands, even millions of records in our log files. That places a heavy burden on our staff to analyze this data. What can we do to help analyze this data? So if our support staff is scanning through millions of entries in our log files, they're going to need some kind of a tool to pull out the appropriate information. Well, that's the nice thing about Amazon services. There's generally a tool that can fit the need. And in this case, it would be Elastic MapReduce. Or we could use a third-party tool such as Splunk. So we can feed this data into these tools, and with some configuration, these tools will put out data that is more easily readable for the support staff. As an additional feature, these tools can perform graphing or mapping that will greatly assist the DevOps engineer in this situation. And as expected, in Elastic MapReduce, we can do some querying. We can query on, for instance, requests that take longer than expected. Maybe we can set a certain threshold and pinpoint those requests. And from that, we can go from 1 million entries into a log file to maybe a 50 or 100. Another example would be we can focus on response codes other than a 200 success code. Another way to pinpoint and to drastically reduce the data that we need to look at. So at the professional level, it's always good to think about use cases and scenarios and how certain services interact with each other. So in this type of scenario, you have an Elastic Load Balancer. You've configured Elastic Load Balancer logging. You have huge amounts of data that you need to analyze. So that's your use case. What's your scenario? Well, we just described it. You can set up Elastic Load Balancer logging. You can send the logging information to Elastic MapReduce. You can focus on specific issues that you're looking for, certain lengths of log times, certain response codes. So those are the types of solutions you want to be thinking about. You need to be able to picture use cases and from that, determine a solution. And this will serve us well as DevOps professionals, and it will serve us well on certification exams. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the theory. Now, let's complete this lesson by doing some hands-on work. So again, we need to configure a load balancer. We need to configure an S3 bucket. I've retained a couple EC2 instances from the previous lesson that we can register to our Elastic Load Balancer. So let's go over to the console. And first, let's create an S3 bucket. Remember, S3 bucket names have to be globally unique. All right, hopefully that's unique enough. Now, let's go over and create our Elastic Load Balancer. So let's click Create Load Balancer. Now we have three types: Application Load Balancer, Network Load Balancer, and Classic Load Balancer. DevOps Pro certification course still focuses on the Classic Load Balancer. So let's create that one and let's give it a name. And we have several lessons on Elastic Load Balancers, and we'll talk much more about listeners in an upcoming lesson. We'll just go with the default security group. We will talk much more about health checks in an upcoming lesson. Again, we'll just go with the default. Now, here's where we can add EC2 instances. And if you're following along, and you don't have instances, just create a couple. All right, so there are 2 instances that I can add to my ELB, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we can click Next. I'll hold off on tags for now. Let's just review and create. We have a listener. We'll go into more detail on that. Much more detail on health checks. 2 EC2 instances. Looks good. Let's create our ELB. And let's go check it out. Okay, so we have an elastic load balancer. We also have an S3 bucket to hold our logs. But there's some more configuration that we need to go. Let's go over to S3. And let's choose our bucket. And I called it S3 for ELB logging. Go into permissions. Yeah, let's click on the bucket policy, and this is where it gets a little bit different. Not difficult, just different. And let's choose the policy generator. All right, now let's select the type of policy. S3 bucket policy. Effect allow. Here's where it gets a little bit different. For the principal, we need to enter the account ID for elastic load balancing in the region we are using. And I will provide a URL in the course materials for this information. And it comes from a table with region name and the elastic load balancing account ID. I am in US West, and the account ID is that. Again, I'll provide that in the course materials. And our service is Amazon S3. And there's a ton of actions in here, but let's just select all actions. And then we need to provide an ARN, bucket name, a prefix, which we'll just call my apps, then AWS logs, the account ID for the owner of the elastic load balancer, and it will be the ID of the account you're logged in with. So it's not this. That was needed for the principal, and this is just your account ID. And we need another / and an asterisk. And if this ARN was in any way incorrect, we would see an error message here. We're good to go. Let's click Add Statement, and let's generate a policy. All right, so there's our policy. And let's copy and paste that. And then we can close out of here. We can go back to the S3 Management Console and paste this policy into our bucket policy editor. And then we can click Save. Okay. Now we can go ahead and verify that everything is hooked up properly. First, we'll go enable the access logs. So let's go back over to EC2. Let's go into our load balancers. And our only load balancer is selected. Now, we want the description tab, and that's what comes up as the default. And let's just keep scrolling down. Finally, we will get to configure access logs. And if it's not checked, we want to check enable access logs. And let's set this to 60 minutes. And then our S3 location. So S3 for ELB logging, that's the name of our bucket. So it's my app. And more than likely, you'd be entering this for the first time. And then we can click Save. Okay. So we've now set up our access logs to be placed in our S3 bucket. Now, the final step is just to verify all of this. Let's browse back over to our S3 bucket. There it is. And we already see we have a new folder created, My App, AWS Logs. There's our account ID. And there is our ELB access log test file. So that's our verification that our log files are going to be placed in our S3 bucket, and right now that is at intervals of 60 minutes. So with that, we have completed this lesson. Go ahead and mark this lesson complete, and let's move on to the next.